Thank you. Just a quick reminder, make sure your phones are set to silence. And before I forget mentioning this, you'll receive a survey for the session by email. Please fill out the session evaluation. I am super thrilled and honored to represent Epic Games in this talk on EOS, Easy Anti-Cheat, and Player Moderation. I'm going to be saying EOS a lot in this talk. So to make that clear from the get-go, EOS is the acronym for Epic Online Services. A little bit about myself. My name is Seb. I work on Epic's technical developer relations team. I specialize in EOS. I've been working in this role for about 3 years, working with EOS for more than 4. I've helped numerous developers ship games that use EOS. I've also recently helped our UE online team implement player reports and sanctions in Unreal Engine's online subsystem and online services EOS plugin. Our team's mission is simple: help developers from indie studios to AAA developers integrate EOS to offer the best online experience to their players. EOS's missions more broadly is about providing technical and operational needs to developers by giving them access to our online services so they can focus on creating awesome gameplay experiences. With my background in developer support, you already know I've sprinkled tons of pro tips and best practices throughout this talk. The talk is going to be quite technical. We're going to dive pretty deep on some topics, but we've also designed it for it to be interesting from folks from all backgrounds in the gaming industry. Really hope everyone in the room walks out having learned cool new things about EOS, Easy Anti-Cheat, and player moderation. EOS is part of a long tradition at Epic of empowering creatives. This goes all the way back to the debuts of Unreal Engine in 1998 and evolving to empowering creatives to commercialize with the Epic Game Store, where Epic gives more back to creators. Adding to that creation tools such as Twinmotion, 3Lateral, and of course EOS and Easy Anti-Cheat services we will be discussing today. Okay, I've said EOS quite a few times now. I should probably give a proper definition. EOS is a set of online services. The design is informed from Fortnite, but we need to be clear that it can be used across all game genres. It's scalable. There's millions of players that are playing games that use EOS. It's intended to enable cross-platform play. And probably the best selling point of EOS, you can get started with it completely for free. It's made by game developers for game developers, engine agnostic, supported on tons of platforms, ton of storefront. We believe the work developer, the work you do, deserves to be seen everywhere. It's trusted by thousands of developers. Okay, let's start getting a little bit more technical. There are 2 major groupings in EOS. We have game services and Epic account services. Game services do not require your players to log in with an Epic Games account. Epic account services, as the name implies, do require your players to log in with an Epic Games account. If you do integrate Epic account services in your game, this does allow your players to join an ecosystem of over 880 million players. For today's talk, we're going to be focusing on our moderation services, third blue rectangle on this slide, which is a game service. That means all the services we will be discussing today are game services and do not require your players to log in with an Epic Games account. The 3 moderation services we offer: Anti-Cheat, which offers cheat prevention and detection in online multiplayer; Sanctions and Appeals, which enable you to impose or lift restrictions on online play; and Player Reports, which enable your players to report other players that are negatively impacting their online experience. We're going to go pretty deep on all 3 of these services, but before doing that, we're going to take a step back for about 5 or 6 minutes as we design the talk to be an almost A to Z in EOS integration. The first thing you'll need to do is go to our developer portal. The developer portal is where you manage Epic developer technologies. Game services are but one technologies that is managed through the developer portal. It's the red rectangle on this slide. On first login, you'll create an organization and a product. The product represents your game. When you create a product, you will have IDs automatically generated, for example, a product ID. And you'll also need to do some minor configurations. For example, creating clients. Clients is what controls access permissions to your game builds to our online services. For example, you could have a game client and a trusted server. You'll have a client ID and a client secret. These IDs will be important in just a few minutes. The developer portal is also where you go download our SDK. Our SDK is what you need to integrate in your game to access our online services. We also have web API endpoints. We'll talk about some of the web API endpoints later in the presentation. The SDK is provided in C and C#, and I've seen wrappers for other languages, Python, Java, JavaScript, etc., created by awesome developers in our gaming community. The SDK is cross-platform, includes mobile and console, is engine agnostic. Epic offers plugins for EOS. There are third-party plugins for EOS in Unreal Engine. There are also third-party for EOS in Unreal Engine with Blueprint integration. There's plugins for Unities. There are also plugins for other engines as well. Now, I mentioned the talk today is an almost A to Z in EOS integration. To be as inclusive as possible, the examples we'll be giving are on the C API. We're not focusing on any specific plugin. Create a dedicated slide here as this is a common point of confusion. You do not need to be an Unreal Engine developer to use EOS. Vice versa is also true. If you're using UE, you're not obligated to use EOS, of course. Okay, now that we've downloaded the SDK from the developer portal, what are the first steps? You'll need to call 3 APIs to get started: EOS initialize, EOS platform create, and EOS platform tick. Notice on this slide, near the middle of the platform options parameter, this is where you'll pass those IDs I mentioned that are located on the developer portal. This is what tells the SDK which product to connect to on our backend. I'm already going to hit you with a couple pro tips here. Here, EOS platform tick, you need to call this function regularly, ideally every frame. If performance is of concern, there's a tick budget millisecond parameter that you can pass to EOS platform create, which will limit the amount of time spent in the SDK. The second pro tip, potentially the most important, the most important in this talk, the number one reason of crash reports we receive for EOS by a landslide is folks accessing the SDK over multiple threads. The SDK is not thread safe. Make sure all SDK API access are from the same thread, ideally your game thread, your main thread. Okay, now that we have our SDK ticking, it's initialized, we create our platform, we're ticking the SDK. The next step is to log into game services. Again, you do not need to use an Epic Games account to log into game services. On this slide, the example given is using Epic Access credentials, but we support numerous identity providers. We also support account systems that have an OpenID endpoint. You'll use our Connect interface to log into our game services. The function to call is EOS Connect Login. You pass in platform access token and the credential type that you're using, straightforward API to use. On first login, what will happen is the SDK will return a result code of EOS invalid user. This tells your game that the platform account logging in does not have an existing EOS product user ID, PUID. Second and last important acronym for this talk, a PUID is an identifier that maps EOS data to platform accounts. Notice I said account with an S. On first login, you can call EOS Connect create user to create a PUID for the platform account that is logging in. Or if you support cross-platform accounts, you could also ask your player to log in with a different set of credentials if they play your game on a different platform, and then call link account to link a new platform account to an existing EOS PUID. All of this is seamless to the player. And a heads up here, we also offer a device ID credential type. The device ID credential type is not a valid identifier for anti-cheat. You can't use it with anti-cheat. Bear that in mind. Okay, now that we're logged into game services, we can start using our moderation services. First one we'll talk about is anti-cheat, which help prevent players from using illegitimate, unfair methods to give themselves an advantage in online multiplayer sessions. This section of the talk will be split up as such. We'll talk about the context under which anti-cheat is supported, integration, player experience, and we'll wrap up the section with a few housekeeping items. Anti-cheat is supported on Windows, Mac, Linux, and Steam Deck. It's not supported on mobile and console, but console and mobile players can play online matches with protected PC clients. In terms of multiplayer architecture, very flexible, supports client-server, peer-to-peer, and listen server. Okay, now that we know the context under which anti-cheat is supported, let's move on to integration. To your build pipeline, to your development process, you will need to add our anti-cheat integrity tool. This is a command line tool that is used to create a hash catalog of files you want to ensure will not be tampered with by players in the context of an online protected session. On the slide is example configuration. For example, exclude path, you could exclude files from being added to the hash catalog. Pro tip here, exclude large asset files, exclude large files, as this will could lead to slow load times. Include path, include files you want to ensure won't be tampered with, executables, DLL, etc. The integrity tool is not a digital right management tool. It's really designed to ensure files aren't tampered with in the context of an online protected session. To generate the hash catalog, you'll have to download an integrity key. You can download the integrity key from our developer portal. You'll also need to ship your game with our Bootstrapper. The Bootstrapper's responsibility is to prepare anti-cheat on the client. It will download a client module, more on the client module in 2 slides, from our CDN. And on Windows, it will start a Windows service, more on the Windows service on the next slide. So the Bootstrapper prepares anti-cheat protection on the client. If your game has multiple launch scripts, you'll need to make sure that the Bootstrapper is the last in the chain. In other words, the Bootstrapper is the one calling your game executable. That's a fairly common mistake we see some developers make. It's just a heads up. When a player launches your game via our Bootstrapper, they'll be shown a splash screen. Example on the slide was taken from Fortnite. Of course, customizable. You can use your game art here. The Bootstrapper icon, taskbar icon, all customizable to use your game art. Before moving on, another pro tip, and this one is very common, comes up very often with developers. You do not need to check to see if the Bootstrapper was ran from your game. If a player runs your game directly and bypasses the Bootstrapper, they'll automatically be kicked from a protected online session. The Windows service. On Windows, for permission reasons, anti-cheat needs to run as a Windows service. This means you will need to include in your install script our easy anti-cheat EOS setup executable. Your product ID here on the slide is taken from the developer portal. And as a Windows service is being installed, if the machine does not have the Windows service already installed, the player running the install kit for your game will need to have local admin permissions. Pro tip here, if you want to be thorough testing your installation process, do it on a clean system, or at least make sure to uninstall the easy anti-cheat service, as other games may have installed it. Like the Bootstrapper, you do not need to check to see if the service is running. If the service is not running, players will be kicked from protected sessions. The client module. The client module is where our cheat detections are located. Very easy to activate. It's a couple of clicks in the developer portal. Pro tip here, always test the module before activating it on your live game. Also very easy to do. You can download a configuration file from the developer portal. You place that configuration file in the same folder as your game executable and rename it to match your game executable name. That will tell our Bootstrapper to download the module from our CDN that is specified in the configuration file, giving you the possibility to do a full test run, your QA team to do a full test run. Another pro tip here, you can subscribe for module updates. Good idea to be notified when there is a new module release. New module release meaning potential bug fixes and new cheat detections. Okay, let's move on to SDK integration. For the talk, we couldn't do a full anti-cheat SDK integration in the interest of time. We're going to focus on the 2 trickier concepts that we see developers run into issues or have questions about. The first one is around messaging. For anti-cheat to be functional, messages need to be passing in client-server between the client and the servers, in peer-to-peer between the peers. And in listen server, you can choose if you want to follow a peer-to-peer model or a client-server model. The example we'll give is on client-server. Concept is very similar for the other multiplayer architectures. There's 3 things you'll need to do. One, you'll need to call an SDK function to be notified when a message needs to be sent. Example on the slide, add notify message to server. This is on the client. This tells the client a message needs to be sent to the server. You can imagine on the server, there's an add notify message to client to send the message to the client. This callback will trigger a function that you write to send a message to the other node, to the server. In this example, anti-cheat does not send the message for you. You need to use your game's networking layer to send the message. Pro tip here, on debug builds, log the message, log the actual message that is being sent. And then the third thing you need to do is there's an SDK function that you need to call when a message is received. Again, pro tip here, log the message when it's received. If there's a message mismatch between the source and the destination, clients will be kicked from the protected session. We've seen it quite often where a game's networking layer modifies the message in transit. One last very important point, you need to call EOS platform tick. I mentioned this earlier. EOS platform tick is what triggers all the callbacks in the SDK. If messages aren't passing at a certain frequency, clients will be kicked from protected sessions. The second tricky-ish concept with the SDK integration is around protected sessions. Now you'll notice I've been using this terminology a lot, online protected session. The reason for that is anti-cheat is only available in an online protected session. Anti-cheat is not available offline. And it's also possible for you to offer both unprotected and protected sessions. The example we're gonna go through is for client server, similar concept for the other networking architectures. So on your server, you'll call a server API function called begin session when you're ready to start a session. Your clients will call a begin session client API and travel to your server. And your server will call a register client to register the client once they have joined the server. At that point, anti-cheat protection starts, and it will end when the player leaves the session, client-side API calls end session, and the server calls a server-side API unregistered client. That's the time window under which there's anti-cheat protection. The SDK does a great job logging around these functions. There's a logging interface in our SDK. Pro tip, use our logging interface and debug builds at a verbose level minimum. You could even do it at a very verbose level. Okay, now that we have the SDK integrated, how can we make sure that everything is working correctly? Give you a couple seconds to scan the QR code. We have an integration checklist. QR code will bring you to our checklist, which lives in our EOS documentation. My pro tip here is probably very obvious. Use the checklist. Can't stress this enough. We've helped developers that ran into issues in live games, which we trace the root cause back to a check that would have failed on our integration checklist if the integration checklist would have been done. Super important. Okay, now that anti-cheat is working correctly, we've gone through the checklist, we're sure that our integration is robust. What is the player experience? When a player joins an online protected session, if our system detects any abnormalities, for example, the game was launched directly, not via the Bootstrapper, the player is using a cheat that is detected, our system will trigger via our SDK a notification informing your game to kick the player, to remove the player from the session. Now, the delay from when the player joins the session to when the kick is triggered can vary by quite a bit. So the system is designed to only kick players with high confidence around there being an abnormality. Also, when a player is kicked, a pending sanction will be created. And if you have our direct ban feature enabled, which you can enable in our developer portal, an active sanction will be created. When there's an active sanction, the player joining in future protected sessions will get automatically kicked. They're banned from playing in online protected sessions. Updates. So you're probably thinking, okay, cheaters, they always find cool new ways of cheating. How do we keep up? I mentioned this earlier. Our new cheat detections go into new client modules, which you can activate very easily on the developer portal. The great thing about this in our system is you do not need to release a client patch. All you need to do is a couple clicks in the developer portal and you get new cheat detection. Again, make sure to test a new client module before actually activating it on your live game. In very rare circumstances, you may need to upgrade the SDK. If ever you do, the SDK is backwards compatible. What that means is you can, in most cases, simply swap the library that you're using with the new SDK library. You shouldn't have to do any code changes. Okay, I'm a developer support engineer. Of course, I'm going to have a slide on debugging. When anti-cheat is running, you can't attach a debugger to your game. So if you run into an issue that you need to debug, the first step you should do is try running your game without anti-cheat. If you can reproduce the issue without anti-cheat, just debug as you normally would. If you can't, here are some tips to help you out. We have a logging interface, as I mentioned earlier. Using your favorite text editor, you can do a find all, and then in our SDK logs, we have different log categories. For example, log EOS will give you all the messages from the SDK. Log EOS anti-cheat will give you all the messages from the SDK related to anti-cheat. Anti-cheat components, the Bootstrapper service, etc., have their own log files. File paths on the slide are for Windows. In the documentation, you can find file paths for other platforms. We also support using crash dumpers, built-in support for Windows WordFault and UE crash report client. If you're using a different crash dumper, in the integrity tool I mentioned earlier, in the configuration, you could specify the crash reporter that you are using. Pro tip here, if there is a crash, the amount of time access is granted to the process is limited by anti-cheat. So if your crash dumper does things like, for example, send the dump to a remote node, what you'll likely need to do is collect the dump locally, wait for the process to terminate, and then send the dump to a remote node. Okay, before wrapping up anti-cheat, let's go through some best practices. Some of these are repeat. That's how important they are. Use the integration checklist. Test your client modules. If you need a reference point for anti-cheat integration, we have samples. In our C SDK download, we have a client server sample, and we also added in our 1.17 release that came out in February, a P2P anti-cheat sample. Developer support is also available on EOS Help. You'll get support from myself and my awesome teammates. Pro tip here, if you do reach out to support, include full logs in your first message. That just speeds up the support interaction so much. And the last point, I didn't share the screenshot earlier. In the developer portal, you can enable and disable client protection and kicks. In an emergency, your live game is running into issues, and you think it's related to anti-cheat, you can, from the developer portal, disable client protection and disable kicks, allowing your players to play the game and then reach out to us so we can figure out what the root cause is. If you follow the integration checklist and test your client modules, you shouldn't have to do this, but it is a fail-safe measure that's there for you to use if needed. All right, let's move on to Sanctions. Sanctions is an independent service than anti-cheat. There is a relationship. Anti-cheat does create pending or active sanctions, but Sanctions is a standalone service that you can use without anti-cheat. Sanctions enable you to impose or lift restrictions to online play. The SDK integration is straightforward, and I'm going to say this before I forget, you can't create sanctions using the SDK. You can, however, retrieve player sanctions. You can query for player sanctions on the game client or on the server. You can use our web API to create sanctions. Example, post request to create a sanction here. You'll notice in the header, there's an EOS access token that is being passed. We have a connect web API endpoint that you can retrieve an access token using the client credentials I mentioned earlier that are found in the developer portal. I won't go through the parameters on this slide, as there's another slide on creating sanctions from the developer portal. A little easier to talk through it on that slide. You can use our web API to create sanctions, update sanctions, remove sanctions, synchronize sanctions with external systems. And just to do a quick recap, a few different ways of creating sanctions. So anti-cheat, if you are using anti-cheat, will create pending sanctions by default, active if you have direct ban enabled. You can create sanctions with the SDK. You can create sanctions using our web API. And you could also create sanctions directly in the developer portal. When you create a sanction, there are some parameters you'll need to pass. The first is an action. There's 2 preset actions you can use, and you could also create your own custom actions. Restrict matchmaking will cause players joining an EOS session or EOS lobbies to be kicked. Restrict game access will cause players joining a protected online session, so protected by anti-cheat from being kicked. They will be kicked. Anti-cheat, when it creates a sanction, the action it uses is restrict game access. You can also create your own custom action. So for example, say you want to limit a player's ability to use voice chat. You could create an action, restrict voice chat. On your game client, use our SDK to retrieve player sanctions and then tailor the gameplay experience based on the sanction action. So in this case, restrict voice chat, you could restrict that player's voice chat. Duration, set of number of days or permanent. A justification, tags, which you can use for search and filtering, very useful if you have a large number of sanctions in your game. And the last, the player field. So you can pass in an EOS PUID, and you could also pass in platform account IDs. And we're going to take a very small step back. As I mentioned, creating sanctions in the developer portal. I do want to briefly talk about access control in the developer portal. In the developer portal, you can use predefined roles or create custom roles to assign access permissions to accounts. So for example, say you have a moderation team and you want to limit access only to our moderation services, only to player reports, sanctions, and anti-cheat. You can use a predefined role player moderation tools and then assign accounts to that role, limiting their access in the developer portal. You can also create custom roles and then control very granularly the access on those roles and then assign them to the accounts. Okay, back to the developer portal. Viewing and removing sanctions. You can view sanctions in the developer portal, example on the slide. So this is a sanction where restrict matchmaking is the action. It's currently active. It's temporary, expires in 5 days and 2 hours. In the developer portal, I can edit the action. I can also close the sanction. Notice the grayed out activate button. If the sanction was pending, I could also activate it in the developer portal. Again, by default, anti-cheat creates pending sanction. This is one way you could activate a pending sanction. You can also do all of this via our web API. Let's move on to appeals. So we offer an appeal functionality to give your players a second chance, or also to catch incorrectly issued sanctions. For Epic, all appeals that are for sanctions that were generated by anti-cheat are reviewed by us to make sure that anti-cheat isn't creating any false positives. The SDK is super simple to integrate. Unlike sanctions, with sanction appeals, you can create sanction appeals from using the SDK. Let's talk through some of the parameters that you would need to pass in. The first, API version, that's a standard parameter in most EOS SDK functions. One of the reasons it's there is for backwards compatibility. Local user ID, this is the PUID of the local player creating the sanction appeal. The reason, this is an enumeration set, for example, unfair punishment, appeal for forgiveness, and the reference ID, which is a reference ID of the sanction that the player is appealing. You can also use our web API to create sanction appeals, and you can also use our web API to read sanction appeals and export them into an external system. Just to briefly recap the different ways of creating sanction appeals, you can use the SDK in your game clients. You can use the web API on your backend or other web applications. You can also create sanction appeals directly in our developer portal. And there's also a fourth way. We have a website you can direct players to. You will need to provide them with the reference ID of the sanction. They can go to this website and create a sanction appeal. Great thing about this website too is they can go back to the website with a reference ID and then see the status of their sanction appeal. Is it pending, denied, or approved? For this to work in the developer portal, you'll need to have the allow users to appeal sanction by reference ID enabled, top portion of this screenshot. Viewing sanction appeals. On the developer portal in the player's profile, you can access the player profile a few different ways. One of the ways is searching by account ID or PUID. You could see the list of sanctions that they have and the list of sanction appeals that they've generated. You can assign sanction appeals. You can change the status to in progress, approve, or deny. Pro tip here, if you use player reports as well, you can use player reports as a source of data to help you make an informed decision on whether or not you should approve or deny a sanction. Of course, if you approve a sanction appeal, the sanction will be lifted. If you deny it, the sanction will be maintained. Okay, let's wrap up the sanction section with some best practices. Players will, of course, be frustrated if they've been sanctioned. To limit frustration as much as possible, you should make it very clear that they've been sanctioned and also make it very clear what features have been limited. I used the voice chat example earlier. I'll use another one here. I mentioned if you have restrict matchmaking, players that join an EOS session or EOS lobbies will be kicked. What you can also do is use the SDK to retrieve player sanctions, see that players cannot join EOS sessions or lobbies, and prevent them from even searching for them. In your game UI, you can make it very clear that they have been restricted from playing online multiplayer in online sessions. Provide an easy way for your players to appeal their sanction. You could do this directly in your game client. It's an awesome feature using our SDK. Your players directly from their game, from your game, can appeal their sanction. An appeal result, whether it's approved or denied, you should ideally communicate it back to the player. And the last point here, depending on volumes, depending on your use case, you may need a dedicated person or moderation team to review sanctions and appeals. That is entirely up to you. All right, let's move on to player reports. Player reports enable your players to report other players that are negatively impacting their gaming experience. Like Sanctions, an independent service, but works really well with anti-cheat as it enables your players to report other players that may be using undetected cheats. SDK integration is straightforward. There's one API function, send player behavior reports. Let's go through the list of parameters that you'll need to pass. The first one, API version, as mentioned earlier, pretty standard in most SDK functions. Reporter user ID, this is the local PUID of the player sending the report. Reported user ID, this is the PUID of the player being reported. I want to take a moment here to make this very, very clear. Notice that how everything in EOS, all the data is associated to the PUID, which means it's associated to all platform accounts. So the player being reported, the report will be assigned to the PUID and therefore assigned to all of their platform accounts for your game. A category parameter, an enumeration where you could pass values such as verbal abuse, cheating, offensive profile, etc. And we have two optional fields. Message is a text-based field that you can use to have your players send you a message, and context field, which is a optional JSON format field that your game could use to send contextual data. For example, think of things like the game level being played or the game mode being played, etc. We also have a web API. You can use the web API to create player reports, example, post request at the top of the slide. You could also use our web API to retrieve player reports, example, response at the bottom of the slide. So creating player reports, you can use the SDK in your game clients. You can use the SDK or web API on your backends, and you can use the web API on a web application. In the developer portal, when you go on the player reports tab, you'll see the stacked bar graph that's trended over time. This is a really great way to see what players are reporting other players from doing that are negatively impacting their behavior. For example, are a lot of players reporting other players from cheating, or a lot of players reporting other players from being verbally abusive, etc. You can download the data from this trend to a CSV. Below this trend, you'll see a list of player reports grouped by reported player, and you could sort in descending order of number of reports. Super easy to spot top offenders. In the yellow rectangle on the slide, you'll see the last category that was passed in the latest player report. In the blue rectangle, you'll see the identity provider for this account. Epic Games in this example, again, this could be a different identity provider. Display name, account ID. And if you click into the orange circle, this is another way of accessing the player profile view. You'll land on the report section of the player profile view. In this view, you'll see all the reports for this player. Great way to spot patterns. For example, is it always the same player reporting this player? Are they being reported for the same reason? Were they reported within a very short time frame, etc.? You could assign player reports to yourself for further investigation. You can mark them as resolved. And in the pink-purple rectangle, you could also see the contextual data. That's the optional JSON format context field I mentioned earlier that your game sent with the report. On the right of the player reports section of the profile view, you can see the player's linked accounts. So these are the accounts that are linked to the EOS PUID. You could also access the player's sanctions and create sanctions. So you can use player reports as one source of data to issue sanctions to your players. Okay, let's wrap up player reports with some best practices. You should be analyzing player reports in aggregates. So you shouldn't worry too much about getting too many player reports. You really want to make it obvious to your players that they can send player reports, make the UI super intuitive. You'll want to minimize friction. So for example, for the reported player field, you could pre-populate a drop-down list with display names. You could pre-populate with display names from all the players that played in the online session. And ideally make the message field optional, as the player does not feel forced to pass in a message in the player report. In the rare event that sending the player report fails, the SDK will trigger an error to your game. You could and should show this error to your player and allow them to send the player report again. Like sanction and appeals, depending on volumes, you may need a dedicated person or dedicated moderation team to go through player reports. That depends on your use case. It's entirely up to you. The ultimate best practice, so all of the services, anti-cheat, player reports, player sanctions we've discussed, they're all independent services. Ultimate best practice is use these services together as they all complement one another. Now, everything we've discussed so far, you can get started with for free. Over the years, we've added some advanced features for Fortnite, for other first-party games. These advanced features require human intervention from our talented analysts and engineering teams. As they require human intervention, they do not scale in a free offering. We've talked to studios, we've talked to developers, and there is a demand for these advanced features. And as such, we've expanded our anti-cheat offering to include opt-in, paid, premium features, and premium developer supports for the developers that need it. These features have been battle tested in one of the largest battlegrounds in the world, and we're going to discuss them now. We really want to make it clear, everything before the slide you can get started with for free. Everything after this slide are opt-in, paid features. So the features we're going to discuss, they're best suited for games that are heavily targeted by cheaters, and they require specific human attention. There are 3 paid tiers, each with different terms. Paid tiers have priority support with our developer relations team, myself and my awesome colleagues, with accelerated response times. We do want to make it clear, on EOS Help, we do offer community support, and we have a knowledge base of over 800 articles available for free to all. The paid features come with priority support and accelerated response times. Okay, let's talk about the first feature, game-specific cheat detection. So anti-cheat collects detailed indicators of game processes and other systems. When those indicators hit a value that can only be explained by the player using a cheat, our analyst team will add cheat detection, banning those players and future players using the same cheat. This is a super complex task as it involves analyzing data from multiple systems, and these systems change through time. The second feature, developer cheater reports. These features enable you to report players that are using cheats. From the developer portal, our analyst team reviews these cheater reports and will implement game-specific cheat detection. You need to use player reports to be able to use developer cheater reports, and our team does approach this by implementing cheat detections for cheats that are used by the most amount of players. Hardware sanctions. So the sanctions we've been discussing today are associated to the EOS PUID, so all the platform accounts. In free-to-play games especially, players can bypass sanctions by creating new accounts. Hardware sanctions is a way of mitigating that as the player's hardware gets banned. These can be automatically generated by anti-cheat, and you could also put a hardware ban in the developer portal, as shown on the screenshot in the slide. The last feature, aimbot protection, for shooter games only. The way this works is your game server will send data to our backend. The APIs are publicly available in the EOS documentation. You'll need to send player-specific data, for example, which weapon the player is using, when does a player take damage, etc. This data is sent to our backend, and our analyst team maintains machine learning models to detect players that are using aim-assisting cheats. This brings us to the end of our talk. Let's do a quick recap because I know I've shared a lot of information with you all today. EOS engine agnostic, works with many workflows. The services are designed a la carte. For moderation, we do recommend using anti-cheat, player reports, and sanctions together. Anti-cheat, cheat prevention, and cheat detection in online play. Sanctions and appeals enable you to impose and lift sanctions on players in online multiplayer. And player reports enables your players to report other players negatively impacting their experience. If you're interested in our paid premium features for anti-cheat, two of my very friendly colleagues, Rick and Mitch, in the room with us, please reach out and talk to them. I'll ask Rick and Mitch to join me after for the Q&A. I hope everyone in the room learned some cool new things about EOS, easy anti-cheat, and player moderation. It was honestly an honor to be able to give a talk at GDC, represent Epic Games. We have an Indies community. QR code will bring you directly to our Indies community on our Epic's developer community. Thank you, everyone. I think we can open it up to Q&A.